Good morning. My name is Jay Kim. I am the president of 3AF, which is for Asian American Advertising Federation. In this crucial time of COVID-19 slash coronavirus, stay safer at home and what's happening. We at 3AF wanted to have important content that's happening all around us, whether how to deal with this economy situation or in this matter, dealing with discrimination against Asian Americans. And with me today, I have Jeff Yang, who is author, CNN contributor, and a co-host of a podcast called They Call Us Bruce. And we have Max Davison, who is a Chief Integrated Officer at Admirasia. And we also have Telly Wong, who is also a Chief Content Strategist from IW Group. I really appreciate all the panelists being on a call today, contributing your time. IW Group have created a campaign called Watch the Hate, which has gotten a lot of press, and that's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing with today. Along with that, Admirasia also have a campaign called Racism is Contagious, and they have a website as well. They both do. I think the topic today is about communication of when discrimination happens. How do we go about it, and how do you communicate, and what kind of changes do we expect? So Jeff Yang is going to moderate and have great questions. Again, at the end of this panel, there'll be information on all these videos. So our goal is to do these videos on a weekly basis. That is going to be on at 3af.org/corona. And we had a podcast of SBA loan information from SBA administration last week. And next week we'll have all different kind of content. So please check back regularly. But let's start this panelist. So I'm going to have Jeff Yang start with questions.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you, Max. And thank you, Telly, for joining us. This is a particularly important topic and an important time for Asian Americans. It's, I think, not hyperbolic to say that this may very well be perhaps the riskiest point in our present history as Asian Americans. This generation of Asian Americans aren't just being beset, obviously, by coronavirus, as we all are. We are also facing an unprecedented array of bias, harassment, and anti-Asian hate that has come about because people have associated the disease with Asians and specifically with China. And one of the things which we as communicators really need to do is assess the degree to which the organic or intended campaigns that have emerged to try to essentially attach this disease to us as Asian Americans, to a racialized dimension, puts us at threat and how we should respond to it. What I think is really amazing about what IW Group and Admirasia have done is that they've taken two independent yet complementary approaches to addressing this larger problem. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys about the kinds of creative decisions, the kind of innovative solution path that you guys took to arrive at your respective approaches. But before that, let's get a little bit more context for you guys and what you do, and talk a little bit more broadly, I think, about this larger dimension of communicating in a crisis. And I'm going to kick it over first, Telly, to yourself, if you could talk a little bit more about who you are and what you do for IW Group.
Okay, I'm the Chief Content Officer at IW Group, and I oversee a number of their campaigns that incorporate an integrated approach that includes PR, marketing, social media, and traditional advertising. And sometimes that gets us pulled into crisis communications as well. So I think what we did for Watch the Hate was really take some best practices from previous experiences and campaigns and apply it to this one.
Thank you so much, Telly. Maxwell, what do you do as Chief Integration Officer for Admirasia?
My primary role is trying to find ways to integrate all the various operations of the company together to move towards one conceivable endpoint for our clients or for the marketplace. So kind of a multidisciplinarian in a lot of ways. I work a lot on the creative side, but I work a lot on the digital side as well, so a lot of my day is spent looking at code. So that's me.
And in the specific run-up to Racism is Contagious, what were some of the things that Admirasia and you were thinking about in essentially deciding that you needed to respond to this crisis, just broadly?
I mean, on the broad side, we're looking at the communication outbound in the marketplace and also in the general media, and kind of recognizing that this crisis does exist and that it's something that we have to be prepared for. As an agency that represents Asian Americans and Asians and Americans, it was important for us to make some kind of statement and do something. But this campaign really started to roll and come together when we stopped thinking about what can we do and started thinking about more, how can we help? And that's kind of what the genesis of this whole platform was.
So that actually brings us to the larger question around when one is moved to intervene. And this is difficult enough for individuals. There's been a lot of conversation around what bystanders should do if they see an act of bias or harassment occurring. I know that there are other organizations that are doing various kinds of training to help people feel comfortable intervening and doing so effectively. But when we're talking about society and we're talking about organizations, and in this case, agencies, that first decision that you have to do something, again, as both of you have said, is really critical. And just speaking from the standpoint of essentially crisis response, what trigger really did you guys encounter, or what do you look for when you see a situation which requires essentially a proactive response of some sort to address crisis? And I'm going to go to you first, again, speaking more broadly and then maybe specifically about this particular crisis.
Yeah, well, I think what really inspired us to do something immediately was several weeks before we launched, a video went viral that a friend of mine had shared, Celia Au, the actress, that showed an Asian man on a subway being harassed and being sprayed with air freshener. And that just sort of stirred up a lot of emotions within me and my colleagues. And then there were other sort of incidents of hate that were reported across the country. And we just saw this starting to simmer, and we wanted to address it head on. And we felt that as an agency with relationships, with some resources, that we were in a place to do something and react quickly and briskly to this issue.
And I think in this particular case, you mentioned the term quickly, right? Speed being of the essence. Was there something, or is there something more broadly about crisis communication that really leans into the idea that it's better to be in some ways fast and to, if you will, nip situations in the bud?
Yeah, from my experience with crisis communications, you want to act quickly, but you also want to have as many facts as possible. And I think given the reporting that was happening with hate crimes and hate incidents, and just the citizen journalism that was being done, like that social media video, we felt, okay, this is turning into something, and now we can react. And we just looked around the room and figured out sort of what do we do well and what can we do quickly, and that's how our campaign happened.
Maxwell, Racism is Contagious came out a little bit later, but part of that was actually an artifact of the different approach you guys took, that data was at the very center of this particular program that you guys have created, this tool you've created, so to speak. It sort of aggregates, again, incidents of hate and presents them in a visualized fashion so people can see exactly what is going on in almost like an epidemiological fashion. So Maxwell, what was some of the thought around taking that approach? And in a broader sense, is there a sense in which essentially presenting data or information is at the center of how Admirasia approaches crisis communication?
I think that all approaches in this context are complementary. And I think for us, in terms of data aggregation and looking at that as a tool, what we're looking to achieve here is really enhancing all of the various efforts that are going on inside of the space. There's always an element in any of these things where when we're turning hearts and minds, people want to be pointed to the empirical data that proves the point. So we wanted to create a bedrock and foundation on factual information and statistics associated with the acts of hate perpetuated against Asian Americans, while complementing all of the various activities that are going on inside the marketplace right now. Whether that be from a visibility perspective with things like Wash the Hate or Hate is a Virus, or things on the more data-driven side, like the studies being led by Dr. Jung with Stop AAPI Hate. We wanted to do everything that we could to help everybody inside of this context.
I think that's really interesting. You mentioned hearts and minds. In some ways, when I look at these two approaches, they both obviously target changing hearts and minds, but in some ways, the IW group's approach was heart first, sort of looking at the emotional valences around what was going on, moved and triggered in some ways by looking directly at individual incidents that were being shared and going viral. And Admiration's approach was sort of minds first, then hearts in some ways, in the sense of gathering data to tell a story and having that story be really compelling, in part because of its scale. And I agree, these two are absolutely complementary approaches. They sort of, in some ways, represent the two sides of our industry and how they do need to work together. And I want to flip this now a little bit to this notion of persuasion, especially when we're talking about this particular kind of a circumstance where we're not, say, talking about cancer. I mean, nobody is for cancer, right? Everybody is against cancer. So if you're doing a campaign to try to address, cancer cure, for instance, or prevention, everybody's kind of going to get behind it. But when we talk about something like anti-Asian harassment or bias, I myself had an incident, relatively minor in the larger scheme of things. It was an episode of harassment that occurred here in Los Angeles when I was waiting to get into a supermarket. And when I shared it, it kind of went viral itself. But one of the things I noted was that there were a lot of people who were responding by saying, hey, I don't believe this is true. Asians don't get subject to violence. You guys want to turn yourselves into victims, etc. So there's a little more challenge and controversy around addressing things like racism, addressing things like harassment, and there's a little more division perhaps in how people respond to it. I'm wondering, as you guys approached this, what kinds of parallels you could see in prior crisis management or prior communications programs that you were able to learn from and implement here, and whether or not you have kind of a theory of the case around persuasion, what it is that moves people to change, not just to become aware, but to actually react in a way that's positive. And I'm going to throw that to Maxwell first, actually.
Yeah, there's an interesting that's an interesting question, and I think there's layers to it. So, taking a step back and talking about precedent, right? So there's a precedent for crisis management and response that we can look at and look to. And you're talking about there being two different angles to this, right? One is on the natural side with the outbreak of COVID-19, and the other being the crisis on the social side, which is the rising hate perpetuated against Asian Americans. And both are very different in terms of how we manage them, but both are happening right now and exacerbating each other. So on the natural side, and this is an oversimplification, of course, it's really quantifiable. You need X number of people, you need Y amount of capital to return to the status quo. And you have empirical data that you can direct to and numbers and say, hey, that'll get us back to normal, right? On the social side, it's different because, again, with the focus on hearts and minds, it's not the same proposition. So we have to convince people that there is an option better than the status quo, and that on an individual level, they have to shift in aspects of their perceptions or behavior in order to make the world a better place. And you have to show them the why and how, right? So in marketing terms, we're talking about communicating, like you said, to like a predisposed audience versus an audience that isn't necessarily predisposed to make change, right? And I was thinking about that in terms of the context of some other movements that we saw in the aspects of persuasion. And after a few conversations, there's three things that I think I can point to inside of that. The first being the aspect of visibility, because this is a numbers game, right? And we need as many people on board as possible speaking to or addressing their truth. And then I think second would be like an alignment or a general consensus on what the mission is that we're trying to achieve from a lot of different stakeholders, and getting all of our ships pointed in the same direction to handle both what the short-term and long-term repercussions of that look like, or ramifications. And then the third is our unity in messaging, kind of a foundational consensus on what we want to say to emphasize the kind of change that we're looking to achieve, and really driving that home through repetition. So that would be my tactical persuasion there.
Telly, I think that the approach specifically that IW Group decided to go with was one that really was leveraging in some ways social capital of individuals who already had trust and already had influence in the Asian American community. And that can be a really effective way to getting momentum, essentially. Can you also share your thoughts about the best way to essentially persuade people, especially again, when you're looking at a very different kind of challenge, getting people convinced, first of all, that this kind of harassment is even taking place. And then secondly, convincing them that they can do something about it effectively.
Yeah, well, speaking in marketing terms, they say, know your consumer and your audience. And I've been, as someone who grew up in New York in the 80s and 90s and experienced, there were a rash of Chinese delivery men that were beaten, robbed, assaulted, sometimes killed. And I remember being a child with a father who was a small business owner and a Chinese takeout restaurant next door. And just remembering the fear and vulnerability when I heard those stories happening. And they were not heavily covered by the media. And this was before, cameras were in every store and every street corner. So they were very abstract in terms of these incidents. And I just remember feeling like, who has our back as a community, and who's speaking out and who's speaking up. And that was really sort of one of the inspirations behind the campaign, is to really put ourselves in the minds of the public. And since we launched the campaign with our influencers, our partners, our celebrities sharing their personal stories of how COVID-19 has affected them, we've gotten a lot of emails and messages from just the general public saying, I've never been a victim of any discrimination, but I'm very glad that a campaign like this exists, because we know that there's some solidarity within the community. And then on the flip side, the day after we launched, I had a friend of mine who's older, and she shared with me a story about just walking down the street in the East Village the day after President Trump's Chinese virus comments, and someone just went up to her. She was wearing a face mask, so someone just went up to her, didn't say anything, and just shoved her to the ground, and broke her hand.
Wow.
Yeah, so things like that are happening, and they don't get reported in the news. But at the same time, I think that's really what we were trying to do with our campaign, is just create a platform and put a face to the community and really demonstrate the personal impact that this pandemic is taking within the community.
I think that what's really interesting about the two approaches is that the approach Admirasia took to sort of aggregate data was to make the problem bigger, was to show the scale of the problem overall. And the approach that IW Group was to make it in some ways smaller, but not smaller as in the phenomenon smaller, but more personal, more intimate, right? To make it feel like each one of us is potentially at risk or in the position to do something. And again, those two approaches really work together really well. We need to feel like this kind of thing is something that affects each and every one of us, whether we're Asian or not. We also need to understand that each of these smaller incidents add up to a groundswell, to something which is an outbreak, and potentially an outbreak that's only going to get worse. So let's talk very specifically about the two campaigns. And Telly, I want to ask you first, Can you walk us through the sort of beat by beat origins of the idea, the kinds of discussions you had to just generate concepts, and what ultimately led to the hashtag campaign, Wash the Hate?
Yeah, this campaign started very differently. We had a call with some other leaders at my agency, and we wanted to do something. And of course, you know, as an advertising agency, your first inclination is, hey, let's do a PSA, or maybe we can get a client on board to do something. And then we just realized there's a million problems going on right now, and this is probably not something at the top of the list in terms of priorities. And we didn't want to sit around and wait, because we found that, you know, day by day, things were changing so quickly. And by the time we scripted something, shot something, put it out there, it might no longer be relevant. So what we initially talked about on a Friday was doing some kind of, and this was happening, what led up to this initial concept was there was a shortage of hand sanitizer at stores across the country, and especially in communities in need. So we thought, okay, let's pull together some influencers, some Asian American celebrities, and get them all together. And we're gonna just have like a hand sanitizer making party. We're gonna bottle it up, and we're gonna work with a community organization, and we're gonna distribute these in communities that don't have access to hand sanitizer. So fast forward to Monday, and over the weekend, we did some research. We found out there might be some safety concerns and issues, and then also social gatherings and social distancing. So it would be not possible to get people together in a room. And then we just pivoted on a Monday and decided to just go fully digital with our campaign, and just rebranded Wash the Hate. And then we launched a week later.
So Wash the Hate literally came out of washing, like washing your hands, as it were, right?
Yes, it was sanitize something or another, and then it just became like, yeah. And then as we were doing research on the hand sanitizer, the CDC says, you know, washing your hands is more effective than hand sanitizer. So we decided to go with that.
I love the fact that that initial insight really did kind of pivot and adapt itself. I know personally, you know, as we kind of laid in our own supplies, that hand sanitizer is basically translucent gold right now. You know, so the idea that both the scarcity and the importance of it is something you'd be highlighting alongside the message around pushing back on anti-Asian bigotry is really powerful. Just so continuing on from that, once you actually came up with the idea of Wash the Hate, what was the next steps for the agency in terms of turning it into something that actually was a campaign?
Well, we reached out to friends of ours, people we know within our orbit, and just asked if they'd like to be part of it. So we didn't do a PSA because of the logistics and budget and all those implications involved. So we asked all of these partners, be it, you know, Tai Ma, Celia Au, the you know, actors, or Carol Lim from Opening Ceremony, to make their own videos. So they would be washing their hands for at least 20 seconds in accordance with CDC guidelines, and then using that opportunity to share a story of how COVID-19 has impacted them on a personal level or within their community. And so we had sort of a batch of videos ready in the queue, and then we had our press release and announcement all set up, and we were waiting for the right moment to launch. And I remember we had this conversation. We didn't want to launch on St. Patrick's Day because it was a holiday, but that was the same day President Trump made his Chinese virus comments. And so we said, you know, the time is now. And we just put it out there, and it just kind of took off.
Fantastic. So Maxwell, now I know that Racism is Contagious actually launched a little bit later. Part of it was that the approach was a little bit more designed around building a tool rather than a campaign. Can you give us a similar kind of walkthrough of the context of how the idea came about, why and how the execution of the idea rolled forward, and what was required to actually build both the team and the strategic partner collaborations that are embedded into this particular tool? And again, for those of you guys who haven't seen yet, racismiscontagious.com is a platform, is a tool that actually is taking data of reported and confirmed acts or media reported acts of anti-Asian violence or bias, and then visualizing them on a map in relatively real time, I guess updating on a daily basis. Yeah, Maxwell, tell us the origin story of this.
Well, I think the origin story starts at the probably the same place as Kelly's, where everyone inside of the agency sphere understands that for our clients there are other concerns going on in a time of crisis, but that something needed to be done to be proactive about these things. From when we're talking about leaning into strengths, a lot of the strength of our team that we believe is we're strong devs, we're strong developers. So building a tool and a technology made sense. And we took a little bit of inspiration, or a lot of bit of inspiration, for what we were seeing in the outbreak maps that were released by CNN or various other institutions tracking the spread of COVID-19. So we wanted to apply some of those same principles to how we were looking at this secondary outbreak going on in society. So basically, we were able to dissect a lot of that technology, and we worked that way. And it was in putting that together that we started to see that maybe the technology was our solution, and that a resource was the right way to go, since the conversation was already underway. And we thought it better to help all of the various stakeholders and partners that we see operating in the space, rather than launching another hashtag, that kind of thing. In terms of onboarding partners, there was a lot of serendipity in terms of our timing. Everyone had needs, and we did a lot of conversations that said, what can we do to help you? And the platform has essentially grown out of that.
Did you face any challenges when you were trying to translate disaggregated data into something that could essentially be represented intelligibly in a graphic fashion?
Yeah, and the challenges are still there. There's a whole bunch of functions that we have right now that haven't been launched because certain amounts of data exist behind walls. So we have to get the right partnerships in place with organizations that are working inside of the space to make this the most robust tool possible. And right now, there are lots of disparate sources collecting data. And the act of centralizing that ends up being the biggest challenge, and making sure that there isn't an overlap in our data, that the numbers are true, that the numbers are representative. That will be a continued challenge for the platform as we develop it out.
So I think that what we're seeing with both of these is that there was a kind of common point of initiation, a common trigger for this. And obviously, you're addressing two sides of the same larger problem. One of the things which I wanted to have you guys maybe share a little bit is in terms of where this larger opportunity or challenge goes next, right? In the course of actually developing your campaigns, you clearly had pretty key objectives or goals or KPIs that we're using to measure what success looks like. And Telly, let me throw it to you first. When you were actually envisioning this, was there a specific sort of goal state? Was there a specific, set of numbers or set of clear thresholds, let's say, for the campaign that would tell you that it was working? And how did you actually calculate that based on the kinds of seeds that you were planting, so to speak?
Yeah, we didn't have any lofty goals, and we definitely don't presume that any social media hashtag campaign is going to solve some major issue like racism at a time like this. But I think what we wanted to do, and again, this kind of goes back to just sort of my experience growing up in New York, we wanted to create these conversations in different pockets of the broader community. So not everyone is going to read a hate crime report in the New York Times and be able to quote statistics and things like that. But however, they might read about this campaign in People magazine or Good Morning America or things like that. So that's what we want to do. We wanted to reach people who would otherwise not be reached through sort of some of the traditional communication sources. And obviously social media makes perfect sense, and wanted to just raise more general awareness about this issue. And the way we've been just sort of been tracking our campaign is just the reach that it's been getting through earned media or social media.
And in the course of that, I mean, obviously one of the things that a digital campaign is looking for is not just people sharing the original content, but following on, telling their own stories, not just amplifying the hashtag, but maybe even creating their own content, their own videos. Did you start seeing some of that happening? Were other people who weren't directly communicating by you starting to pick up and amplify and share and build?
Yeah, glad you asked that, because yes, that has been happening. And we're really happy to see that. So after we initially launched, about a week in, we started to see everyone was sharing content, and some of the videos went viral, like obviously Tai Ma's story. And what we saw was, D&I groups, ERG groups reaching out to our campaign saying, hey, how do we get involved? What do we do? And it was like, share the content, we'll make a video. And we have about 24 Asian American community organizations that are endorsing our campaign, some of which have made their own videos, like the Asian American Journalists Association. And then just the broad reach of the campaign has gone to, some of the D&I team at Walmart had made a Watch the Hate video. People at executives at Nielsen have been tweeting about the campaign. And then also, something interesting that popped up recently was the University of Utah had their faculty come together and make a video and share that. And many of the people in that video were not Asian American. They just wanted to stand behind this message. So we're seeing a lot more of that, which is fantastic. And we're just seeing people from all different types of backgrounds and communities come on board with this message and make their own content and really promote what we're doing. So it's been incredible.
If you are an Asian American agency and you're reaching people in Utah, then something's working, right? It's not exactly the epicenter of Asian American population and culture, but that's fantastic. Maxwell, same question to you. When thinking about what Racism is Contagious can do or be, or could do and be, what were some of the things you were looking for as far as core objectives, key goals, or maybe metrics that sort of proved out the idea that it was becoming something valuable?
I mean, we're still relatively young in the process right now, but in analytics growth, we're seeing more and more traffic to the platform every day, and we're seeing uncannily high levels of engagement time on the site. So people are there, they're in the map, they're reading the stories, that kind of thing. And then a secondary metric that we're hearing anecdotally is that once people are on the page, they are going and they're reporting incidents. People have come back to us and told us that. Since we're working with third-party partners on that, we don't have access to their analytics, so we're hearing that. But that people say they're now aware and they're reporting, and that this is going into the broader system of compiling this. That is really a key and core objective. But there's a lot of what we're looking at right now that's kind of future forward on where the platform's going to go. So this is where we are today, but what we really need to build out is a more robust system of resources against this, so that when people are victims of hate, they understand what their rights are inside of that, and we can connect them with the proper people, whether that be in law enforcement or human rights organizations, who can help, catch the bad guys here.
That's really amazing. And I think that it's interesting that that notion of the feedback loop is so embedded into this particular execution, right? It's not just enough to show people what's happening, it's to encourage them to share their own stories. This is also true of Watch the Hate. So one thought here is, as you actually look at the platform, what are some of the ways you see this as potentially evolving? You mentioned, again, maybe adding additional layers, additional maybe ways of visualizing things. One thing that really brings to mind, is brought to mind to me, is because what you're doing is you're mapping these things geographically, there should be a way to actually filter the reports to see whether or not there's any clear patterns that are emerging, right? You know, we've obviously seen a lot of these reports coming out of New York. Is that because New York is a hot zone? Is it because people are more connected to media and more likely to have access to awareness of these kinds of resources? To what degree do we see a rise in reports based on a rise in COVID contagion, right? Is there sort of a parallel line for the two outbreaks, as it were? These are all things which I think in the future people are going to want to look at. And I'm really interested to know whether or not you're looking at and almost building into the tool itself, a DIY analytics tool set.
Yeah, the DIY analytics tool set is actually built. It's going to be rolling out shortly in terms of how we can dissect different aspects of this data and different components inside of that too. When looking at change over time, though, right now it might be a little bit deceptive because we are in a stage right now where proximal contact isn't happening. So it might look like a flattening in terms of reported incidents, but this is a long-term resource. So we have to see what happens and what sort of spikes exist once people are returned to some degree of normalcy inside of their lives, that kind of thing. So yes, coming soon is the answer to that.
It's it's always about version 2.0, 3.0 and beyond. That's actually the last set of questions I want to address with you guys, which is literally the what next of both of these campaigns and more broadly, our community and the degree to which we're going to continue to see this sort of ramping up of racial incidents. One thing which people have been talking a lot about already is even after people are released from lockdown and some semblance of out of the home normalcy begins, there's always the potential for a second wave of outbreak. And Telly, I know that you have roots in Hong Kong. There already are concerns that we're seeing a second wave out there.
Right.
So my first thought is this, Wash the Hate in particular, because it came so quickly at the beginning of the campaign, it feels as if there is going to be a need to kind of have ready and waiting another tier of individuals who can amplify the message if and when this disease takes another sharp spike. And again, alongside that, bigotry or anti-Asian racism rises as well. So what does 2.0 look like for Wash the Hate?
Wow. Well, actually, the campaign is living, and we are building on an ongoing basis. So just last week for World Health Day, we worked with some partners to release another batch of videos that they produce, and David Henry Wong and some other people within the community shared some videos on World Health Day to not only raise awareness about the issues that we talked about, but also thank the frontline workers and the healthcare workers. So that's something that's ongoing. And what we're doing as sort of a more formal 2.0 is we're creating some new content that we're going to release hopefully at the end of this month or the beginning of Asian Heritage Month to drive more awareness and a new call to action for our campaign. And then while that's all happening, we're having meetings and we're having conversations with other similar campaigns, both in the US and overseas in Asia, because they've heard about what we're doing in Canada and in Hong Kong and Korea, and they've asked how can we sort of come together and do something. No one knows what that is exactly, but that's the beauty of conversations.
I think that's one thing which has been a little bit obscured, at least here in this country, the fact that this is not just an Asian American thing, that anti-Asian harassment and bias has actually kind of gone global. And we're seeing again the UK, Australia, New Zealand, other English-speaking countries, but also places where the Asian diaspora has reached that are not predominantly English-speaking. facing this same sort of phenomenon. That's clearly the next step, right? To try to figure out a way to make this a little bit more of a global message.
Yeah, that's one of several next steps, but that's what we're trying to do now is really identify the right partners and put together something, sorry about that, and put together something larger and addressing a larger global issue.
On that note, Maxwell, I mean, right now, obviously, the Racism is Contagious platform is focused on the United States, but even if it doesn't actually step out and look at kind of global incidents, one thing which I think you mentioned in our previous conversation was that there is some thought that there may be opportunity to look at what's happening to Asian Americans from the context of how bias and harassment has impacted other communities. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what plans or thoughts there might be from both of you guys to broaden the conversation around bigotry and hatred to include African Americans, Jewish Americans, and other groups that are also being impacted in this fashion.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the beauty of building a tool in some ways where, the structural foundation that we're looking at could really be applied to any community who's facing these sort of issues. So this is all about coalition building in terms of our next stages. And I do think that a lot of what we've built on the foundational level and a lot of what we'll continue to roll out in future iterations could be utilized for any number of tracking and measuring for this kind of hate targeted at specific communities across the country or across the world.
I do want to note that both Wash the Hate and Racism is Contagious are hashtags that don't actually specifically say Asian American or AAPI. That these are basically designed to be broader and more about civil and human rights and not just about Asian Americans, even though this is obviously where we sit as a community. And Telly, I want to ask, was that intentional from the very beginning, or is that something that is just an opportunistic response to the fact that hashtags have to be short?
Well, absolutely intentional. We didn't want to make COVID-19 about Asian American victimization. Obviously, this is a pandemic that affects everybody. So that was really the goal, was to talk to our community and go and talk to everyone outside of it as well.
I mean, obviously, racism is not just the victim's problem to deal with, right? Far from it. And one of the things I think that is really admirable about both of these campaigns is that they aren't focused on simply motivating or engaging Asian Americans. They really are focused on elevating this problem into something that both non-Asians are aware of, and also that they're concerned about, that they're actually, is a feeling of responsibility towards it. Maxwell, similarly, on that point, racism is contagious. Is there a thought that this is something that was designed to, really be a vehicle for a larger conversation around racism beyond even our community?
I think ultimately, yeah, all of the goals that we have here is to stand up and oppose bigotry in any of its insidious formats, right? Or in any way that it comes about inside of our societies. So again, this is essentially about coalition building. So this is the first stage in something that's larger. And again, we just have to keep focused on our goals and achieving them on a step-by-step basis.
Well, I think both of these campaigns show both the innovation and creative power within our communities, within within each of your agencies, certainly, but also the degree to which leadership is so critical in these times. I know that neither campaign is something that is being fueled by brands or clients or outside money. That these are both things that IW and Admiration have done out of visible need and as essentially volunteers. I think that's really powerful, and I hope that there is a way to rally more investment and more resources behind this. I am curious to what degree you guys are seeing maybe more movement from other partners and maybe even clients and brands towards addressing this very conversation. Telly, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, we've had some brands approach us about how to get involved. There is definitely interest. It's usually a similar situation where it's someone internal that has a personal connection with this issue, trying to rally the troops. There is interest at sort of at various levels, and we're just trying to push it upward and see what happens.
Maxwell.
I think it's generally the same status right now. It is, we're hearing a lot of support from our clients and partners, but right now we're forging, I think on both sides, our own case studies on how we can address these things. And we're anxious to see how the brands play in this in the future.
Well, I would absolutely love people to be looking at these two examples as case studies, as models for how both communicators and ultimately other institutions can intervene in these kinds of crises. So thank you guys so much for sharing these stories so articulately. Jay, is there anything else that you'd like us to address, or do you feel like we're okay? We're a little short of.
I think you guys done a great job. Thank you. Jeff Yang, you've been our keynote speaker at 3F Summit. Always appreciate you always willing to jump on and help. I'm going to come back to you to talk about some of the other great stuff you're doing for Asian American community about the art. So I'll come back to that. But Max and Telly, thank you so much for jumping on and being our panelists. And most of all, I really want to give out thanks to IW Group and Admirasia for doing such inspiring work, because a lot of instances, this is a great example where some of these things we have to do it ourselves because no other association or brand supporting. So we at 3AF hope that other advertising association, multicultural advertising and marketing groups join us in taking action, as you guys mentioned, to support. And in this crucial time, ad industry leaders can prove that they really are inclusive and practice diversity inclusion by supporting Asian American anti-discrimination efforts. So I think you guys are doing tremendous work, very inspiring. I hope that there'll be more awareness, and then also this is such an important matter too, because Jenny Hum, friends and our 3AF executive director, have experienced discrimination herself in NorCal, where she was at picking up drugs and at CVS, waiting in line, and she was wearing a mask. The gentleman in front of her turned around and stopped her and started to wipe himself with Clorox disinfectant, and she just felt so, I guess, humiliated. And these are things such a near and dear. So I think, it's important that we ourselves are doing this, but it'd be great if we can get some more movement and support. And, this is kind of the reason why 3AF is wanting to support and do as much as possible, because, these are the things that really represent important things that is going to help represent Asian American consumers, and which is one of our mission is to make sure that our Asian American consumers are well represented and properly appointed. So having said that, I would ask that those viewers please share this video. It's very important, very informative. And also, if you go to 3af.org/corona, there are other important information and also ways to support 3AF as well. So I want to kind of end with Jeff, that some of the things that you're doing, I know we talked and you're doing some awesome things with supporting Asian American art and AAPR art centers who are also suffering in this time. So if you can give us a quick kind of a summary of some of the things you're doing, that'd be great.
Sure. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that the other maybe unspoken victim of this era of Corona is organizations that have served as the pillars of our communities. And that includes obviously service and advocacy organizations that are providing direct health resources, clinics and so on and so forth in ethnic enclaves like Charles B. Wang in Chinatown, New York. But the sort of direct impact that is occurring to arts organizations is something that tends to be overlooked. The Asian American arts and media community has been forced to, in many ways, cancel most of their activities. After all, it's really hard to do things with live audiences when live people cannot get together in groups of more than one. And yeah, so as a result, we've seen things like Asian American film festivals canceled across the nation, seasons of theater canceled, musical performances and the like. So one of the things that we're starting to see and that I've been privileged to be a part of in terms of conversation is people trying to figure out ways to do these things digitally in this time of lockdown. Visual Communications, which does the Los Angeles Asian American Film Festival here, they are actually partnering with with CAM, which does the San Francisco Asian American Film Festival, and Pacific Arts Movement, which does the San Diego Asian American International Film Festival, to do an online virtual film festival that specifically is going to try to address some of the larger issues around anti-Asian bias with the kind of content they're presenting. So that's going to be happening May 1st through May 9th. And there are conversations with theatrical performers, with musical groups, and so on and so forth to extend that first week of May festival forwards, so that really Asian Americans can essentially own our month, APA Heritage Month, in a digital format. So we're going to be trying to compile a list of a lot of the different activities that will be taking place in virtual analogs of the originals over the course of May, and hopefully we'll be able to share that. But again, it's really important that we remember things can't stop just because everything else in our lives has come to a little bit of a pause. People still need to nourish their souls. They need to feed their heads as well as their hearts and bodies. And the Asian American community has always been about all of those. So yeah, thank you so much, Jay, for inviting me to take part in this conversation. Thank you, Maxwell and Telly, for, again, representing your agencies and doing such great work. And anything that you need from me, please let me know. I'm happy to contribute.
Yeah, maybe in the future, once that happens, maybe we can do another video panel in regards to some of the awesome, Asian American AAPI performance art thing that we're doing, so that we can create awareness and get more audience to be able to watch and support Asian American artists and performers. So again, thank you so much, and appreciate it. And hopefully, you guys continue to do great work so that we can slowly get rid of these discrimination that are happening and people are being more aware of it. So thank you so much. You guys stay safe and healthy, and I hope to see you guys around. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.